While I lived in New York, the Metropolitan Museum was my home from home. And I was particularly grasped by the full frontal stillness of ancient Egyptian statuary. And that full frontal image has played out in much of my work during this period that I did all the male explorations. There's something very still about the symmetry of a seated figure facing forward, and I employed that a lot throughout. Also, I was reading Joseph Campbell's book on primitive mythology, and having grown up in the Free State on a cattle and sheep farm, horned animals played a large part in my childhood landscape. And in the mythologies of, well, he called them primitive people, but I would just say really clever, insightful people, used the idea of horns and horned figures in their mythologies and in their totem animals and so on. So I have used the idea of the horned figure kind of extensively during this period of time. This also eventually led to a limited edition artist's book that I made with 10 woodcuts and with a long bilingual poem that writes to this idea of moving back through the corridors of time and finding ancient sounds and rituals that have been forgotten. And this was all part of my reformation of the angry, stern patriarch of childhood. I was reading Esther Harding's book, Women's Mysteries, Ancient and Modern. She is one of the sort of seminal Jungian feminist therapists and writers and thinkers of the 70s and 80s. And the idea of nature being sacred and outdoor spaces being sacred really came up for me during the time I was reading her works. So the idea of outdoor shrines and monoliths and places in nature made with rock and stone and tree and hilltops really grabbed my imagination. And this was the beginning of a period that followed on the Reformed patriarch that I did during the male explorations. And this was finding passages through and out and into a changed landscape. And of course, in the process of finding this changed landscape, I realized you have to go through the mother. And I don't mean by this my biological mother, but the idea of mother, the idea of earth, the idea of goddess, the idea of a changed gender in the image of God, is to go through the mother to this changed landscape. And that influenced me for a long time. I was drawing myself as a tree, which is of course a very interesting symbol because a tree simultaneously grows up as it grows down and buries itself in the soil, and it is also a mirror image of itself. So the tree, not only because of its sort of mythological and symbolic meaning, was also a great idea for me because on the farm where I grew up, a tree was like a magical oasis. You know, in the Free State, it's flat and barren, and the horizon is 360 degrees around you. So wherever there was a tree, we as children would climb it, and it would just be our haven. New York City is a city of books. There are many booksellers, bookstores, booksellers on the streets and everywhere, and I just love books. I have my best conversations and arguments with the authors of books. I annotate in the margins and argue with them or agree with them or expand on what they have to say. So that is also where a lot of my thinking and my ideas come from. And at the time, I was reading the works of Maria Gimbutas. She's an archaeologist that did extensive work on excavating in Turkey or in old Anatolia. And this was a time before patriarchy. It was a time before the written word. So what is left there are images. And of course, her interpretation of the images take us back to the Great Mother, take us back to the reverence for the goddess. So I was thinking to myself, okay, as a lapsed Calvinist, what do I do with this? I am not a particular believer in any particular faith, but religion has woven itself through my thinking and through my world. And how would I create goddess? So as I was reading Maria Gimbutas and the things the women did, spinning yarn and weaving cloth, I thought, the spinners, this is such a wonderful metaphor for growing and becoming. So I started this thinking around what eventually became my book, Song of the Spinners. But I started with the idea of women growing and tending flax, and then harvesting the flax, and then preparing the flax into fibers and spinning the fibers into yarn, and using the yarn to weave, create a weaving frame and create this wonderful fabric. So in that process and in my thinking, this fabric manifested goddess. So to me, that was the idea of creating goddess for me. Flowing out of the Song of the Spinners and my idea of women's work of spinning and weaving that is sacred work came the idea of a sacred mirror. I was reading Patricia Lynn Riley's book, God Who Looks Like Me, and that was an interesting idea. We are so used to, in our Abrahamic religions, to see God as God the Father. How about God the Mother? And how do we access God the Mother? Who is God the Mother, God the female? So I started working with posing my models facing each other in postures of devotion, and I called this whole series of works Sacred Mirror. And the idea was that through our devotion, through our prayers, we actually create the sacred other that mirrors us. So that was the sacred mirror for me. And this led to a whole exploration that eventually lived under the overarching title PostChristian Altar Images, of which there are some examples in this exhibition as well. For the past 2 millennia, patriarchal monotheism has effectively kept women on the margins of religious thought and religious office. In a series of 6 prayer books, 6 artists' prayer books, I have created etchings of these devotional figures, and I have deliberately filled the page with each figure, leaving only a tiny margin around it, reversing that idea of women being marginalized. And in this case, women's religious practice is at the center.